I know a number of you. I've been working with IHS, Marty, I don't know what, since 2010 or so, for quite a while. And you know, it's a little nerve-wracking coming here because we do all this stuff, and it's like you don't have to see me. And so, you know, I can do sort of reports. But we're doing a lot of good stuff at UNO, very much thanks to your support. As I mentioned, we've got a new Urban Entrepreneurship and Policy Institute that's focusing on a number of issues, obviously related to entrepreneurship and policy. But that got us into looking at some of these criminal justice reform issues. I'm also running the honors program now at UNO, and so we've got about 1,500 students, outstanding students in the honors program that we're able to pull from for the events that we run on campus. But today I'm here to talk with you about a topic that, again, you guys have helped to support the research over the past 3.5 years or so on criminal justice reform and the revitalization of at-risk communities. And I will admit that I'm somewhat nervous to give this talk today because usually I give the talk to a group of undergraduates who almost always know nothing about this topic. And my guess is I hear some folks from Mercatus are here that I don't think I know who you are, but I've not met you in person. And other folks who may actually know something about this, which means if I say something that's factually incorrect, you're going to scowl at me or whatever else, where the students will just be like, sure, right? So here's the rule. If I say something, especially when I get to some of the Arlington data, that you know is wrong or you know why it is how it is, shoot your hand up and let you say why it is, because as far as this is an educational opportunity here, and I'd rather that get corrected and then I can learn from that too. Because as I'll go into, all of these problems that we see in the criminal justice system in the country, we like to think of, say, incarceration as a national problem or as various state-level problems. But the problems are more complicated. It's a problem at a county-by-county level, or in Louisiana, a parish-by-parish level. And when you look at the different rules that are being applied in all the different parishes or all the different counties, you see a whole different set of rules and different sets of circumstances. And understanding why we have this national problem really requires us to understand the problems that are happening at the local level. But let me not get ahead of myself. I don't know the folks' background here. I want to give you some background so we can have an intelligent conversation about this. Some of this, I imagine, many of you will already know this, so bear with me while I get through it, because I want to make sure we're all at least at a level that we can have a thoughtful discussion about this. So I mentioned we have an incarceration problem in the United States. Currently, right now, 2.3 million people in the U.S. are incarcerated, and that amounts to about 1%, a little less than 1%, 0.7% of the population. This might not seem, I guess, like a large number, that 1 out of every 100 people are locked up, either at the local, state, or national level. But let me suggest to you that, one, this is a very large number of people. And if you don't think 1 out of 100 is a lot of people to be locked up and physically in a cage that the state controls, think of it in comparison to, say, the various countries that we like to compare ourselves to all the time. Because you often hear that the U.S. leads the world in per capita incarceration, which is likely not true. I think China and Russia and some of the other countries are probably higher. They're just the data, you just can't trust the data. But compare it to the data of nations that we like to compare ourselves to, like the NATO countries, right? And the per capita incarceration there. So this is my only joke, right, that it's off the charts, because when you can create the chart, you can make it literally off the chart. But what you may not be able to read are the numbers. So we incarcerate 698 people per 100,000. So that is this number at the top, which you probably can't read. Next is the United Kingdom, which is incarcerating 139 people per 100,000, right? So you're looking at roughly, what is that, about a fifth of our incarceration numbers, all the way down to Denmark and Iceland and the Netherlands, and there are all reasons why, right? But you're looking at like 1/20th. And so when you look at the nations that we like to compare ourselves to, we're incarcerating far more people, and there are reasons for why that is, which I'll get to in a second. But what's important to understand is where they're incarcerated, because we often like to think of this as a national problem, like the U.S. incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. And sometimes that can be confused as like the federal government incarcerates more people than anyone. And that's just not the case. And so Prison Policy Institute has done a really wonderful set of graphs and charts about all the states of the nation. If you're not familiar with Prison Policy Institute and you care about this topic, go to their website. Lots of wonderful graphs. This splits it up, right? When you look at where the vast majority of people in the U.S. are incarcerated, you're looking at state prisons and local jails. Vast majority. So it's about 10% in federal prisons. 90%, give or take, 85 or so, right, are at the state level. And when you look at this at the state level of each individual state, you also notice dramatic differences between what's happening in different states. So Louisiana, we don't lead the nation in anything good. We're often at the bottom of education and bottom of health, and New Orleans is usually at the top of happiness in some places if you like to eat. Not in health, though. But where we did lead the nation, we're now 49th again because we've lost to Oklahoma, but we did lead the nation in per capita incarceration rate. A number of reforms by our recent governor have allowed us to drop our incarceration rate. We're now second in the nation behind Oklahoma. But our per capita incarceration rate currently right now is around 850, 900 people per 100,000. So if you go back and you look at the national rate, right, you're looking at, it's a significant difference. Right, so if the national rate is 698 people, right, Louisiana is about 1,000. So again, if you think that the United States rate is bad by itself, like Louisiana is even worse. Virginia, where you guys are either living or at least working right now, has a similar chart, right? Starts at the bottom left, goes to the top right, and then it's not as bad as Louisiana, but still pretty bad, at least compared to the United States as a whole. Massachusetts, bottom left, top right, but as we tell anyone who takes any introductory class with graphs, what's important is not necessarily the direction of the graph, but what are on the various axes. And so when you put all of these graphs together, right, so you overlay Louisiana and Massachusetts and Virginia and Texas, right, why not? They do all bad stuff, apparently, in Texas. Right? That's what you see. So Virginia really isn't that bad as compared to, say, Louisiana and Texas. But Massachusetts, if you're looking at per capita incarceration rate, is significantly lower than some of the other states. So it's not just the case that we're worried about incarceration. Right? So if you're worried that, say, 0.8% of the population is under state control because they're literally in cages owned by the national, state, or local governments, that's a huge problem. But there are an additional number of people, right? Corrections, right, is just one slice of that. There are a lot of people who aren't incarcerated, but they're they're on probation, or they're on parole. And so keep this chart in mind, this colorful chart. That's our prison chart. I'm about to click it over to the probation and parole chart. The color chart here is going to match up with the colors on the next slide. That's the response. Yeah. Ooh, that's just under 3%, 2.2%. Right? 7 million people are either in prison, on probation, or on parole, which means at a very direct sense, they are under the control of the government at some level, right? Either the federal government, state government, or local municipalities. With that said, right, and again, this is one of those talks where it's like, I want to point out some of the challenges to you. I want to point out sort of what's happening right now. But part of the challenge here is to sort of figure out what's going on, figure out where the problems are, and how to address those problems. So when I see, say, a large number of people on probation, I think, okay, it's much better that those people are on probation than they're in jail or prison. But why do we have such a large number of people that are under state control? And how they're under state control, again, this is the national statistics. Again, it's going to vary state by state. So quickly look at Louisiana, right? We have a pretty equal distribution between probation, parole, and state prisons. Actually, I should pause. Everyone knows the difference between probation and parole, right? Does anyone not know? Okay. So someone tell me, this is the participation part of this talk. Difference between parole and probation. Who knows the difference between parole and probation? Because a lot of people are like, yeah, I know. And now no one wants to put their hand up. The difference between probation and parole is what? Yes, sir. Oh, Alabama. That's okay. We beat you guys.
It's a bad time for me right now.
It's also like the first time we beat you since
8 years.
Yeah, 8 years. I understand that. Yeah.
Man, you're from a different part of that state. Chad can give you shit for this.
Probation and parole.
Parole, getting out of prison early for good behavior, so it's leaving the actual physical location of a jail or prison. Probation being the requirements of behavior that you have to maintain while you are outside of prison.
Yes, and so another advantage of, say, probation is that's an alternative too, right? So someone who goes on probation didn't necessarily end up in jail or prison to begin with. And so if you get arrested for something and you plead no contest, or you could get out in probation, right? You can go on probation instead of going to jail. Right? And so how this splits up is going to differ state by state. So watch the probation chart. This is the important one for this one. So probation, comparing Louisiana to Texas, right? Far more people on probation. On this one, watch the local jails number. This is comparison of Texas to Virginia. Same number of folks on probation but the number of people in local jails is up dramatically. And then comparison of all three of those to Massachusetts, right? Vast majority of people on probation. What you also know, and I put at the top, are the number of people who are under state control generally in terms of, so you're looking at 2.6%, 2.5% in Louisiana and in Texas. When you go to Virginia and Massachusetts, you're looking at closer to 1.5% and 1.4%. So how, say, Virginia and Massachusetts deals with the people who have committed crimes in their states differ significantly. How Louisiana and Texas deals with their criminals, people who commit crimes, differ significantly. And in those comparison states, you have basically the same number of people that are being arrested. Or at least being put through to where they're either in prison, in jail, on probation, or end up on parole. Okay, so here's the other challenge, right? Because the people who are locked up, or people who are put on probation or on parole, if we think about it as a national statistic, that's misleading because it varies depending on state. We think about it as a state statistic or a local statistic, right? That's also misleading because when you go into certain municipalities, who is getting locked up is also disproportionate, right? And this is where we want to take some time to look at issues related to race in the U.S. So right now, 64% of the U.S. population is white. 39% of the incarcerated population is white. When it comes to black Americans, you're looking at 13% of the population, but that represents 40% of the incarcerated population. And we can see this problem dramatically when we start looking at the incarcerated numbers of certain states, right? So here is Louisiana. Louisiana is always first because we're one of the worst, and I know what I'm talking about when I talk about Louisiana because some of the times the numbers just don't, when you're on the ground, you know what's going on. So what you see here is a significant difference between the black percentage of prisoners or incarcerated individuals and white percentage, right? But let me suggest to you this is not just a problem with Louisiana, right? Here is Texas, right? Not as bad. Clicker work. Alabama, you're going to see the same chart. Large white numbers in the population, relatively small numbers in the prison. Relatively small numbers of black population, relatively large numbers in the prison. Right, here's Virginia. You guys pretty much can't distinguish it from Alabama. Minimal. Maryland, Missouri, Illinois, Michigan. Constant pattern. It's not just us in the South. Okay? So this is a constant problem. It's not just there are a bunch of racists in the South. There are. But the problem here isn't so much necessarily racist cops, racist laws, racist judges in the South, and that's like skewing things. It's that these are trends that you see nationwide. And it's important to understand when we think about what's happening and why we have problems with the criminal justice system, what's going on. As I said, most of these problems are local. And so one of the most dramatic statistics that when I started first doing this 4 years ago, whenever we started giving these talks, is when you start breaking down the populations in local areas, especially in local jails, and who's sitting in local jails right now and why. The vast majority of people sitting in our local jails right now have not been convicted of anything. 2/3. that doesn't mean they're not dangerous. It doesn't mean they're not guilty, right? It doesn't mean you want them on the streets, but it does mean that the process has not run its course and they haven't been convicted of anything, yet they sit there. And there seems to be something significantly wrong with our criminal justice system if people are sitting in our jails for, in many cases, significantly long periods of time, having not been convicted of anything. And this is going to be one of our challenges if you're interested in reducing the population of incarcerated persons in the country because you think it's a problem to have people locked up in cages when they may not necessarily have done anything wrong, right? So if you look at it, a lot of those people are sitting in there for drug crimes. Can you in the back see? I can't tell. Can you see that? Okay. Right, so you've got a number of people who are sitting in jails for drug crimes who haven't been convicted of anything. That's a problem. That's a problem. We can talk about property crimes and talk about the other things, but what I want to do is to take a look at your situation here in Arlington. First, let me start with Louisiana. So this is Orleans Parish. Let me show you what Orleans Parish is doing that's a problem. Right? So this is the Orleans Parish inmate search page. I can go on this and start looking for people who are incarcerated. So if a friend of mine gets locked up, I can go on to see what the person did, see how much what the bail is and whatever else. Problem is when you go to search on the Orleans Parish Sheriff's page, it doesn't work. Not a surprise, right? And so if you actually want to try to find someone in the Orleans Parish prison to help them out, you can't. Good case that yours works. So I went on your website, your sheriff's website, to try to figure out who is in the Arlington County Jail right now. Like, literally updated those numbers yesterday when I was on the plane. We did a search last week, so you can go, you click the search button, and what's really nice or bad, and we can talk about the good and bad parts about this, is that when you click the search button, every single person in your jail right now shows up. So you don't have to search for anyone, all of them. And so when I did this, this was last Wednesday or Thursday, there were 332 people sitting in your local jail. And for all those people, you can click on them. So this is Mr. I picked up someone who I couldn't pronounce his name, Sarafel. He was someone who's been put in since last Thursday, right? So last Thursday when I ran the search, and yesterday when I was on the plane and updating my slides. This is a guy who was in there between last Thursday and yesterday. So this is a guy who's been in there for a couple of days. And if you're probably not going to be able to read it, but he's in there for a felony of marijuana possession and some sort of obstruction of justice. He's also been denied bond. So he can't get out. Arrest and a fleeing from a law enforcement officer. But you can go on there and look at all these things. So what we did was we went and took all the data from all the 239 or so people in the prison and ran the demographics on your own jail right now. Like not right now, but we did this past week. And here's what you got. So right now, Arlington, Virginia has approximately, here are your demographics. This is not your jail demographics. This is Arlington, Virginia. 71% of people living in Arlington right now are white. 8.83% identify as black, and other is 15.95%. It's important to note that in that 15.95%, 10% of those folks identify as Asian. So it's a very small number of Hispanics, a very small number of Arabs or Indians or other folks it's mostly an Asian minority on that. When you look at the jail demographics, so again, watch the red, black, and peach chart here. 63% of the people currently sitting in your jail are black, 17% white, and 12% are Hispanics. Right? Again, this is very similar with what you're seeing, in the state generally. Right? So also in your jail right now, right? Again, I apologize because I know the rest of these slides, but these again we just looked up, right? So you've got 344 people incarcerated. 57.3% of these folks have not been convicted of anything. Have been convicted, sorry. 43% haven't been convicted. The vast majority of these people cannot be bailed out. The vast majority of them are on some sort of probation violation as we scrolled through. There's not a lot of violence. There are people that are on a lot of property crimes, and then they get out on some sort of probation. This is where I'm looking for assistance. And then they violate the terms of their probation. My guess, and again, this is just a guess, is that one of the terms of the probation is often drug testing. And then they fail the drug test. or they otherwise fail to check in with the probation officer. In Orleans, the drug testing is a problem. So there's no rhyme or reason in Orleans whether or not people who are let out on parole are drug tested. When they are drug tested, they're much more likely to end up back in the jail as a violation of their parole. I have no idea what the situation is here. I'm hoping, do any of you know? Okay. If you were students, I would say, well, there's a paper. And 5% can be bailed out. And I'm going to put up those bail statistics right now. So again, it's similar to what you're seeing nationwide, but again, your numbers are unique because of the population demographics. So this is the chart here of every single person in your local jail right now that can be bailed out. Okay? And you can look to see what, if you're interested at all in this, I have the spreadsheet. Shoot me an email, I'll send you the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet has every single person's name on it. We went in and identified why they were in there, what their bail was, and whatever else, how many days they've been in there. So what this is a chart of every single person who can be bailed out. On the far right, how much money needs to be put up for them to get bailed out. The 7 or so people in yellow are the people who had bail, right? They could get out. And between last Wednesday when we did the search and yesterday on the plane, they are no longer in your jail. So 7 of them. Now what I can't tell is, I can't tell for the folks who were in there like 60 some odd days why they got out. They probably didn't make bail. The charges were probably dropped. That's why they were let out, or something happened where they ended up with time served or something like that. I couldn't figure it out, and a quick Google search wasn't giving me the answer. But if you're at all interested in this, I can send you all this data. What's really good about what's happening in Arlington is the small number of people that can, in theory, get out for like $1,000. Now, it's a small number of people, but also that there are any people who can get out if they can only put up if they only need to put up $1,000 is a problem. Right? Because these are people who probably don't present any danger to the community. If you can get out for $1,000, it means we don't mind having you out in the community. And so the question is, these people can't find $1,000. If you were put in jail, I asked, this is not a rhetorical you. How many of you could come up with $1,000 to get out on a, identity theft or larceny or like Ethan Williams, possession of drugs? Right? He's been in there 9 days. Actually, add 6 to it. He's been in there 15 days for possession of drugs. He needs $1,000 to get out. How many of you could come up with $1,000 to get out? All of you? Okay. What would happen if you were in your jail for whatever it is, do the math, for 14 days? You'd probably, lose your job maybe? It's IHS. They're progressive. You might not lose your job. I lied. I guess there's a second joke in the talk. Most people would lose their jobs, right? You lose your job at some point. If you're like any of these other folks, 30 days, you're going to start missing payments on your house. You probably lose your kids, right? And it's $1,000, $1,500. So when I went to, say, Wake Forest, and you put it up, and it's like 30% of the people in their local jail could get out if they only had like $1,000, that's a huge problem. But you've got like 15 or so people whose lives are probably being ruined right now because they can't come up with $1,000. For me, that's a problem. It's an issue of justice. And again, if you're interested in these issues at the local level, those are real people with real families who have kids or friends, and a difference can be made here. And we could talk in a bit about what you might be able to do. So again, 2.3 million people. How did we get here? Jason Brennan and I, you guys know Jason, all right? Jason's over at Georgetown. He's the author of like 50 books at this point. It might be like 50, 55 books by the time, since I started talking. Jason's great. We've got a book coming out in December that looks at the financial incentives connected to the criminal justice system. And what we argue is that a lot of these problems that you see aren't necessarily connected to issues like systemic racism and other problems like that. That exists. But one of the claims that we make early on is that because of the way the financial incentives have been structured, if everyone was a certain and the same shade of tan, you'd see the similar numbers because of how many people are profiting off of our current system right now. And who's there to profit? Like we did an interview before, like who's profiting off of the criminal justice system? The answer is everyone, except for those people that are currently sitting in those jails and prisons right now. So politicians, local law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, service corporations, all the people that provide services to the jails and prisons themselves. This is a huge business. I'll go into the numbers in a second, but it's a massive business, and what you're looking at is you're looking at people needing to operate against their own personal financial incentives and act in the best interests of people in our community who have no political capital and who can't come up with $1,000 to get themselves out. That's the challenge, right? That's the challenge. And so this is one of those problems that when you look at it and see that this isn't a national problem in the sense that it's like the federal government, right? I mean, it is to a certain extent, but then it's a problem at the state level, it's a problem at the county level. It becomes depressing when you think, well, how do I fix this? And it's got to be almost a county-by-county fix. So our book coming out, Injustice for All, How Financial Incentives Grow, you can read it. Probably up on the wall at some point once it actually comes out. We can provide you a copy with it. But what we do in this book is go through all of these various problems. We talk about who's profiting and why, and then we suggest some solutions. What I won't do is I'm not going to go through the book. I've got other interesting things that aren't in the book to talk with you about. If you're interested in that, I will send you a copy of the book. But what I do want you to see is just how much money is going through the system. Again, I thank Prison Policy Institute for doing this, but you're looking at $182 billion per year. We're not very good with numbers in this country and understanding like how much like that is and how much a trillion is and how much. So let's put this in context of what that cost is. So if you look at, say, like the SNAP program, we're spending 2.5 times on our criminal justice system we spend on the SNAP program, which is, in my view, and this is where I might get some anger for some economists, in my view, that's the most efficient program we run in the U.S. when it comes to a benefits program, right? We just cut checks to people. We give it on a card, right? It does wonderful things for people who are poor and can't afford food. And we're spending 2.5 times the amount of money locking people up than we're spending on that. This might also get me in trouble with the economists, but if you want to look at also economic productivity, that's lost just by virtue of locking people up. If you imagine that they all had, say, minimum wage jobs, which wouldn't necessarily happen because some people wouldn't have jobs and other people would have more, but you're looking at $33 billion of productivity lost just by the people that are sitting in those prisons. It's a crass way of doing it, and the numbers would need to be done better. But it gives you a rough idea of just how many people in there and how much person power is being lost basically sitting in these cells. So what we also talk about in the book, and what I want to bring to your attention are some of the problems and the who is profiting and the sort of how we got there. So one of the things that we've seen is that criminal justice reform measures. So we had one in Louisiana, and there have been throughout the states. They've been challenged by people who have things to gain. And so perhaps the worst example of this is my friend, the sheriff. He's not actually my friend, just so we're clear on this. My friend down in the sheriff of Parish, who when Governor John Bel Edwards had an early release program for people, Governor John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, who just won re-election, had an early release program of people who had been serving 7 to 12 years in our state prisons, released them up to 3 months early, so like not released early at all in the grand scheme of things, right? So that they could show that they could identify the people who are least likely to offend. 98%, 97.7% success rate, which is incredibly good for a program like this, right? The sheriff fights it, right? Because these are the people who can work in our prisons. These are the, quote, good ones, right? They can work on our cars, right? You might not be able to read this, so I'm going to read this middle paragraph. In addition to the bad ones, in addition to them, they are releasing some good ones that we use every day to wash cars, to change the oil in our cars, to cook in the kitchen, to do all that where we save money. So don't release them early because they help us and they basically work for free. And there's more working for free, right? So these are other articles of other horrible things that are happening in the criminal justice system. I'll just skip over that. Money and bail bonds. But when you hear people working for free, right, we're thinking of people like the folks that are in the Parish jail, right? But you're also thinking of articles like this. So this is Salon. You've seen a bunch of these things that are slavery in the U.S. prison system. What these articles are mostly talking about is Unicor and the state-level versions of Unicor. Does anyone know about Unicor? No? So what I usually do is I go and look at the chairs and see where they were made. I should have done this in advance. Nope. Nope. Half the times when I go to universities and I look at the chairs, they were made in a Unicor state-level facility. What this is the prison work program, where folks come in and they are paid either nothing or a couple cents on the hour to produce chairs, to do sewing for Victoria's Secret, to operate in AT&T call centers, to do all sorts of things that, on the one hand, and again, I'm not like, I don't bash the police, I really don't. I don't bash the criminal justice system. On the one hand, you say, these are opportunities for people to get work experience. On the other hand, they're working for for-profit companies for no money. But this is how Unicor, you might be able to read what's in the box. Imagine all the benefits of domestic outsourcing at offshore prices. It's the best kept secret in outsourcing. Right? That's our government. And that's the government program, federal government, and how they advertise the prison work program. So again, it's how we frame this and what we're looking at with these individuals. So what should we do? Jason and I give a number of ideas throughout the book. I'm going to run through those quickly. Happy to talk about them. I think there's like a discussion or Q&A at the end of this that I'm happy to talk through some of these. We argue that you need to reduce the number of crimes generally. Right? This should, I imagine, a sympathetic audience here. That if no one is harmed, we shouldn't consider it a crime. And there are lots of things. Drug possession is easy. But there are all sorts of things on the books right now that if no one is harmed, it shouldn't be a crime. Right? And if it's not a crime, the government shouldn't be involved. Right? That's simple. But beyond that, right, it's not just about things that are not harming anyone. Right? If I'm going to use drugs, it's not going to harm anyone else in theory. But there are lots of things that are harms that are not crimes. Right? Just because I harm someone, it doesn't mean that the federal government or the state government or the local government needs to get involved. So we could expand the use of tort law and allow individuals to go after other individuals when they think they've been harmed. There are all sorts of challenges and problems with tort law. There are places that we can't use it or can use it. Many of you know John Hasness over at Georgetown. He's written a bunch on tort law and how it can be expanded. If you're interested at all in this, convince him to bring John Hasness in. But all sorts of challenges here, but you could expand tort law. And then what we also argue is that we align the financial incentives, right, in the criminal justice system. So right now, our position in the book is that you don't have necessarily a lot of bad cops and bad judges and bad bureaucrats, but they've all been incentivized to act in a certain way. And so one of the things that you should be doing is understanding when you put a law into place what the financial incentives are, what the incentives are off of those laws, and then adjust it to try to fix that. So, for instance, one of the things we suggest is eliminating cash bail. This is a challenge. We can talk about it at some length. But what folks were doing in, say, New Orleans was that they were funding the courts off of the bail system. So whenever the judge assigned a bail that had to be paid with a bail bond, right, instead of just someone going in and coming in with cash, the court received a percentage of that amount. Right? So you can imagine right now what the judges did. Anyone want to guess? Well, not excessive because you want people to pay it, right? What did they do? Would they allow me to come in with cash? No. They made it impossible for someone, like literally you could not pay your bond, or you pay your bail with cash. You had to go to a bail bondsman. And that's how they ran the courts, right? And it's horrible. And it just so happens that it's the father-in-law of the mayor right now who is doing it as the judge. And it doesn't seem to matter, right? It's horrible. But the other side of the story is it costs a certain amount of money to run the courts. And so if you don't want to pay taxes and you don't want to otherwise provide the money to run the courts, the judges have to get creative. And so Judge Cantrell, I don't think, is a bad person. He was given a bill, and he had to figure out how to pay it. Just like if you had a bill for your apartment and you're $100 short, you're going to have to figure out how to pay it. And so he did what any rational person would do. He tried to find a way within the existing rules to generate that money. The problem is that like those 6 people sitting in York County Jail right now, there were real people who were harmed, real people who were kept away from their families, real people who shouldn't have been involved in the first place. So how do you fix it? We talk about municipalities and paying for their inmates, right? So quickly, if someone designs a diversion program in their municipality, instead of sending one to the state prison, Often it's the city that pays for that diversion program. But if the person instead is sent up to a state prison, guess who pays? The state, not the municipality. So there's a financial incentive to put the person in the state prison instead of looking at a diversion program. And it makes financial sense. It's not like you're a bad person for saying we want to offload the costs, but that's just the rational response to these types of behaviors. We also present other ideas to incentivize jails, which I can go into. We expand the use of alternative punishments, suggest other things like flogging and service. Went through that one quickly. Well, look, people think that it's inhumane or barbaric that someone gets whipped, right? Is it more inhumane that we put someone in a cage for 5 years and take them out of their community or away from their family, and also punish their family members and their children from having them taken away? Now, maybe not the solution isn't flogging, right? But when we use the example like flogging, you think immediately that's something that happens right away. The person is punished. It's harmful. I would not want to be flogged, right? But it also returns them to their community, returns them to their children, and it doesn't cost a lot of money. So what are other alternative punishments that operate like that? Not necessarily using flogging, but other things. We suggest short prison sentences. What I really want to get to, how am I doing on time? Right? We're doing okay? Because what I want to get to is some of this other stuff, which is better understanding the causes of crime. Because a lot of times when folks come in, I don't know if you've had some of the other folks come in and talk about criminal justice reform issues, but people think that this discussion starts when the person gets picked up and put in the police car, or when the law is created that ultimately leads to the person getting picked up and put in the police car. But let me suggest that if the discussion of criminal justice reform starts when the person gets put in the police car, it's too late at that point. What you want to do is prevent that person from getting picked up and put in the police car, right? So reduce the number of laws, whatever else. But one of the things that we want to look at is why people commit crimes, and we don't know. Like, this is a problem. We just don't know. So one of the things we've seen, I'll put up a graph in a second, is that the amount of violent crime, the number of violent crimes in the U.S. has gone down considerably over the last 15 years. Dramatic, right? Spiked up, dramatic decline down. And there are all sorts of explanations as to why, and no one really knows. And so there have been a number of studies that looked at some of the environmental causes. Mother Jones, bless their hearts, ran a really thoughtful and good study on the connection between lead and crime. Now, this either could be causation or it could be correlation, right? We know the communities where lead is high. We know the effects of lead. Does lead cause crime? Not clear, but there's certainly a correlation. There was a study that came out. This was October 3rd, so just last month, from a guy at Colorado State, that there was an exposure to air pollution increased violent crime rate. There was a study that came out 3 years ago that looked at air pollution IQ. That was picked up by the Marginal Revolution guys like yesterday or 2 days ago. It was making the rounds on air pollution and lowering IQ. They had some suggestions as to what to do. They were talking about taxing, like more taxes on roads and things. But there's some correlation, or some thought there's a correlation between pollution and crime. So you can look into that, right? That's causing some problems. We look at families and community organizations. What's the role of those? But I want to focus on this, the role of entrepreneurship and what we can do in those communities themselves to help people in those communities create things of value. Because for me, when you talk with folks in these communities, one of the things that you realize very quickly is that when people have ownership over something, and all of you know this, right? They see it as theirs, and they take care of it. And one of the challenges when you drive through a lot of these communities, and many of the people will tell you this, right? They take ownership of their house. But when you go beyond that, it's not a desirable place to live. And that puts it mildly. And so what we need to do is think about how do we help people from these communities create businesses and otherwise create things in their own communities so that they end up policing, in the broad sense, what's going on in their communities themselves. So some of you, I think, know this. We just got a large grant to study minority entrepreneurship and some of the barriers to minority entrepreneurship in New Orleans and throughout the southeastern United States. And one of the things that we're doing is looking at what are the challenges to starting businesses? What are the challenges to creating community organizations? What are the challenges to putting up those brick and mortar type things, right? Because not all business is brick and mortar, right? But what are the challenges to setting up a restaurant, to setting up a business in the community? Because if you believe there's a connection between crime and what like the physical space around you looks like, then you want to try to do those things or encourage those things that help develop that physical space. So we got a grant to study these things. I've got a lot of libertarian friends, and they're convinced that like the biggest problem is like licensing laws. I'm not convinced that's the case, but we're going to find out. One of the things that we were surprised by is there's no data. So there's been a bunch of money flooding in to support minority-owned businesses, minority entrepreneurship, especially in New Orleans after Katrina, and no one has any data. So some of you may be aware of like Grameen Bank and what they've done in Southeast Asia and South America. They've got a lot of data. And so when we put in this grant to Templeton, I assumed that data for the U.S. existed, and it doesn't. So we're in the process of collecting it, and I don't have anything at this point to share with you, even like informally. But we're hoping to find out what the causes are. What our community partners tell us is it's really a knowledge problem, that it's not a capital problem. That for a lot of these people, I mean, they don't have access to any substantial capital. But even if someone came and gave them access to capital, they wouldn't know what to do with it. That they're not around people who have owned businesses. They're not around people who have handled money. And so what they need is that knowledge. And then once they get the knowledge, they can work with the capital. But here's the biggest the challenge. So if we're looking at entrepreneurship or we're looking at criminal justice reform, it's understanding what these problems are. And so there's a capital problem, there's a knowledge problem. But let me suggest that there is another problem that's perhaps more important that also gets overlooked because it's difficult to have these discussions. Anyone want to guess? Some of you probably know. Looking at all the people in the U.S. that are incarcerated, the majority of those people, it's less than 50%. But most people are there for what? You want to guess?
Marijuana.
Drugs?
Mental.
Who thinks drugs? Mental illness is tough because it's not a charge. Right, so there's no way on the you're probably right, but you look at like the booking sheet.
20%.
You look at but there's no way to. You're probably right. There's just no way to like identify that. That's the problem because when they book you, right, they don't book like possession and mental illness. But that would be really good data to find out, and someone probably has that. And so drugs. Anyone think drugs? Reason most people are there? Okay, for those of you who didn't put your hand up, you want to take a guess? If you know, it's kind of cheating, but. Any idea? Drugs actually second, in a distinct second, to violent crime. Sorry? Violent crime. 40%. Rape, murder, violent assault. That's a lot of people in there for violent crime. And keep in mind that folks who are in prison for violent crime, a lot of times violent crimes get reduced to nonviolent things, or get reduced to possession, or get reduced to other things. But that's your number of people sitting in U.S. jails, prisons right now for violent crime. And as I said, violent crime has gone down considerably over the last 20 years. Right? But when you want to put this in context, right, this graph means nothing without some sort of context. So when you compare the U.S. in terms of the violent crime rate, so we have about 380 occurrences of violent crime per 100,000 people. Compare that to other nations in the world. That puts us third in terms of violent crime per capita. Now, I don't trust the data coming out of Brazil and Zimbabwe and Jamaica and whatever. I don't, who knows, right? But compare us on the violent crime, 382 instances, to countries like Germany, Italy, Sweden, the other places that we frequently like to compare ourselves to. It's dramatic. So, like everything else, though, this 382 instances, they are not evenly spread out across the country, right? So here's the violent crime data of the top 40 or so cities in terms of violent crime in the U.S. Keep this 382 number in mind. That's the average across the U.S. St. Louis, last year, 1,817 instances of violent crime per 100,000 people. Now, I gave a talk once outside of St. Louis, and the response was, well, that's not happening in all of St. Louis. It's just happening in certain parts. I'm like, and that's a problem, right? So when you look at it community by community, yes, there are neighborhoods in St. Louis where there is no crime like every other city, which means that 1817 number goes up even higher in some of these other neighborhoods. I don't know how anyone can function with that much violent crime going on in the communities, and that's what gets reported. Right? In many of these communities, you don't even see, they don't even call the police when stuff happens. So violent crime numbers are tough because, especially when comparing the U.S. to other nations, because how people characterize violent crimes are different. And inside the U.S., you want to drop your violent crime rates, so there's always incentive to maybe report violent crime as nonviolent crime and other things. But murders, bodies you can count, right? Bodies you can count. And so don't just separate violent crime. Let's look at the murder rate. So this is the U.S., right? So this is the top 50 cities in the world when it comes to murders, and our friend Caracas is usually at the top, 130 homicides. But we've got 4 cities in the top 50 in the world in murders in the U.S., and you can guess them if you don't. D.C.'s not on here, right? So it's St. Louis, Baltimore, New Orleans, and Detroit. In the world, top 50 in murders. Okay? Like, this is not good. Right? And so this was 2016. There are some interesting changes between 2016 and 2018, which is the last year we've got data. And what I want you to notice is I've been, if you've watched Conan, right? Conan O'Brien back in the day, for me to poop on the Triumph, the insult comic dog, right? I've been pooping a lot on New Orleans and Louisiana, but look at us, right? We're down to 50th in the world. Which, wait a second, you laugh, but that's a significant improvement. So go back. We have 45 murders per 100,000 people 2 years ago. And in 2 years, we're down to 37 per 100,000 people. And we're on track for this year to be about 30. We've made significant progress in New Orleans with all sorts of initiatives that I'm happy to talk about. But this can be fixed. Right? This can be fixed with community development, with more policing, with all sorts of things. So this stuff isn't hopeless. But what you've also see is that there's one city on here that wasn't on the list before, a U.S. city, that's now on there, which is San Juan. I don't know enough about Puerto Rico, but I know what has happened to Puerto Rico in the last 2 years. And so I can make a guess as to why you're seeing more murders in Puerto Rico now than what you saw 2 years ago. So what's worse? It gets worse, right? It's not like an infomercial where it gets better. It gets worse, right? So these are the bodies. These are the ones you can count. Right? These are the people who wind up dead, right? But what you would hope is that even if people are winding up dead, we are arresting people for killing them. And that's not happening. Crime clearance rate in the U.S. by type. Violent crime, so clearance rate, a crime is considered cleared if the police arrest someone for it. Doesn't mean they've been found guilty. Just means that the police have identified someone who they think is responsible. So like, this is going to date me a little bit, but like with Nicole Brown Simpson's murder, that was cleared because they arrested O.J., right? Even though he wasn't found guilty. So this is all the times they've arrested people, not necessarily found them guilty. Murder in the U.S., so violent crime, right? This isn't split up by murder at the top is 61, but violent crime, 45%. So for murder, rape, and assault combined, violent assault, over half of the time, they don't arrest anyone for it. Washington Post did something very helpful. They went through all the top cities in the U.S. and they built a homicide database. And they wanted to see where people were getting murdered and when the crime was being cleared and when it wasn't. And they mapped them all. And you can go to the website, and if you want me to send you the slides, I can provide the slides, so you can go to the website, but just type in Washington Post homicide database. 50% didn't result in an arrest. And unfortunately, like everything else here, right, it's not evenly distributed across cities. So I'll start by picking on New Orleans. This New Orleans, some of you guys been to New Orleans, right? So right around where the right around where it says New Orleans, that's like the French Quarter, that's probably where you visited. All of the orange dots on the map, can you see that? I can't tell from that. Can you see the little orange dots? Those are all murders in the city where no one was arrested. The green dots were murders that were arrested. The orange blocks are areas where people get murdered and no one gets arrested, and the green blocks are where people get murdered and people get arrested. Does that make sense? Anyone have questions about what those dots and blocks are? Because it's going to be important for this. Okay. So here's a general map of New Orleans. You can see the orange blocks. Those are all the places, again, where people get murdered and no one gets arrested. What the Washington Post did was overlay this with census data, looking at the various racial demographics of the city. You can probably guess what you're about to see, but I'll show it to you anyway, right? That the purple areas of the city are predominantly black or African American. All of those orange blocks are inside of predominantly black and African American parts of the city. This is not just New Orleans. Dallas, right? It doesn't matter. It's the same story. It's the same story no matter what city we look at. Here's Baltimore, right? Again, all of those orange blocks are in black or African American parts of the city, right? Here's St. Louis, right? Same thing. So go back to New Orleans. Why this matters. And so one of the things we did was we plotted on our map all of the grocery stores in New Orleans. Grocery stores is a proxy just for businesses that need to actually be established somewhere, brick and mortar. Everyone needs to cook and eat. We identified grocery stores as a place that carried celery, onions, bell peppers, and some produce. So that is produce, but meat, like raw meat, like chicken or whatever else. Because if you're going to make a gumbo, you got to have celery, onions, and bell peppers. And you're going to need some seafood or meat, right? So that's how we identified a grocery store. And we plotted them all on the map. And you probably are going to know what you see because we're going to overlay that with our crime data and our murder rate. And what you'll notice when I put all the black dots on the map is that there are none in the orange blocks. There are quite a few in the purple areas. More than enough grocery stores in many places to serve various minority communities throughout New Orleans. What you'll notice is that 0 are in the areas where there is a low clearance rate, where people are getting murdered or there's violent crime and no one's getting arrested. And so it's incredibly difficult for anyone in any of those parts of the city to do anything, right? Because you're spending more money just to leave your neighborhood to go to the grocery store. There's a lot of crime. It's a problem. And we know where these parts of the city are. And so what can we do? So there's been a lot of work on black entrepreneurship and how black entrepreneurship has driven a lot of the crime drop in these cities. When you go neighborhood by neighborhood, what you do see is what people often call gentrification. Gentrification is not necessarily white folks moving into black parts of the city, but it's that's not what that is. But you've seen that a crime drop when that happens. When people go in and start businesses and start building in houses, the crime drops precipitously. And so there have been a number of articles that have come out recently on it. But one of the challenges is how do we do it? Because if you live in, I drive around Arlington, and I don't see anything like this. This is not New Orleans after Katrina. This is New Orleans 2 weeks ago. And I needed to stand in front of this green thing. The top left picture, that house is abandoned. On the top right picture, those are not abandoned houses. People were living there. The bottom picture, the house that looks like it's falling apart and the green stuff's growing on it was abandoned, but there were people living right next door to it. I don't know your backgrounds. I didn't grow up in any neighborhood that looked like this. And I cannot imagine what I would think about my prospects for being successful. What is the name of this room? It's like the thriving, peaceful. So yeah, this it looks like the opposite of what this room is supposed to be. No, I'm serious. This is a problem. This is not a third world. This looks like a third world country. This is New Orleans right now. And this is Baltimore right now. And so what you see is you need to get a movement in these areas from this to stuff that looks like this, right? But here's the problem is that a lot of the people who are, local politicians or otherwise connected, you see that and go, that's not a place I would go to, right? It also looks run down, but those are thriving businesses in certain parts of New Orleans that have taken areas that look like this and have turned them into things like that. And what you'll notice when you look at cities, and we had a great example of New Orleans. I know the Mercatus folks did a lot of work on New Orleans after Katrina, but you could see this happening so quickly. A development from something that then looks like this, right, top left, to something that looks like bottom right. And what you saw in this is, if you do know New Orleans, this is Ferret Street. That what you saw on Ferret Street was you saw houses within 3 blocks of Ferret Street look like this. Businesses that looked like top left there. And then a bunch of funding that came in to create new businesses, and now those are houses that are selling for $800,000. within 5 years. Almost no crime in those areas if you look at the crime map. There are no green dots, there are no orange dots, there are no dots. And it was a relatively high crime area before, relatively speaking, by New Orleans standards. Or by like national standards, not New Orleans standards. So what we're doing is looking at entrepreneurship and how we can help build up some of these businesses and other things that take up physical space and community organizations. But what we're also doing is looking at an educational side. Right? What can we do with people who don't have the knowledge to know what to do with money? So New York Times did this, New York Times did this study that a number of you, I think, probably saw back in 2018 and tracked, it was like 10,000 boys who grew up in rich families. Many black, many white. And what they saw is that, I mean, as you can see right now, just because you grew up in a rich family, if you were black, you were far less likely to be rich yourself, to be wealthy. And so there's some problem. We got to figure out what it is. And part of the challenge right now is that it's not entirely clear what it is. And there's no question that racism and that certain problems with the various laws that we have plays a role in this. But what I tell people in the criminal justice discussion is that if you reduce the criminal justice issues down to just racism, that you're going to miss a lot of it. And if you try to solve the criminal justice problems by solving that you're thinking you're solving what is primarily a racism problem, you're going to create all sorts of other problems because that's not what's driving the criminal justice stuff. Right? It's money that drives the criminal justice stuff. It's almost certainly a knowledge issue and money that's driving something like this. And so our challenge and what we're working on in New Orleans and working on this with your help, with IHS's help, you guys have been a wonderful partner for us for the last however many years, been going out and giving talks, but also supporting our people here, is trying to understand how we can provide educational opportunities for people in these communities, what they need. Right? Because one of the challenges of education, especially with something like this, is that you don't want to go in and say, I mean, and you know this, you don't want to go in and say, well, I'm going to tell you what you need, and then like try to give it to them. You need to find out what they need, and then you need to help them provide it, right? So this is the other joke, right? So this is where Don Rumsfeld is correct, right? You've got your known knowns, your known unknowns, and your unknown unknowns. And I think one of the challenges that we're trying to do is from the standpoint of those individuals, they have their known knowns. They know what their problems are. But there is also a set of things that they don't know. Right? And we're trying to figure out what those things are, right? Is it licensing? Is it knowledge? Is it something else? But then there's a whole set of other things, these unknown unknowns, that we're also trying to figure out that are presenting a challenge. And so this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing in New Orleans, and I think this is something that my hope is that if we're even sort of a tenth as successful as I hope we are, it can be a model to what you could do in other parts of the city, because we've seen so much progress made in New Orleans, both in terms of community development and in terms of reduction of crime and in terms of some economic opportunities. So again, thank you very much for bringing me up here. I really appreciate it, and I really also appreciate very much so all the support that you've given to me, you've given to my folks down in New Orleans, because a lot of this stuff wouldn't be possible without support from this organization in particular.